Hidden behind the door, he watched his wealthy mother mercilessly humiliate his pregnant wife. The matriarch demanded she leave, never suspecting the quiet girls actually owned the very walls around them. How heavy is the price of pride when the truth finally awakens? The Atlantic wind howled against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling mansion, carrying the heavy, metallic scent of an approaching storm. Inside the sprawling ocean-facing living room, the air felt even thicker. Elena stood near the glass, her hand resting gently on the swell of her pregnant belly. The quiet art restorer felt completely swallowed by the cold, flawless luxury of her husband's childhood home. She wore a simple, light-colored maternity dress, a stark contrast to the dark mahogany furniture and heavy velvet drapes that seemed to close in around her. Seeking comfort, her fingers instinctively found the old brass compass pendant, resting against her collarbone. It was a humble piece of her grandfather's history, worn and slightly tarnished, yet it was the only thing in this massive house that truly belonged to her. Outside, the sky bruised into a deep, stormy purple, mirroring the isolation she felt every time her husband left for work. On the slick coastal highway, Nathaniel Sterling gripped the steering wheel of his SUV. His flight had been grounded by the sudden hurricane warnings, sending him back to Charleston days earlier than expected. The 32-year-old real estate developer was thoroughly exhausted. He just wanted the quiet warmth of his wife. For months, Nate had convinced himself that his mother's icy demeanor toward Elena was simply the harmless pride of a traditional Southern matriarch. He had brushed off the tension, believing that time and the arrival of their first child would soften the edges. Today he just wanted peace. Back in the living room, the heavy oak doors swung open, without a knock. Victoria Sterling stepped into the room. She didn't walk, she glided. Even with a severe storm brewing just beyond the glass, her hair was perfectly styled, her posture impeccable. "Still staring out at the water, Elena?" Victoria's voice was smooth, dripping with that refined old-money sweetness that offers owls felt like a velvet trap. Elena turned, her expression guarded but calm. "The storm is moving in fast." Victoria sighed, a delicate practiced sound, and moved toward the glass coffee table. She dropped a thick vanilla folder onto the pristine surface. "Storms come and go, my dear. It's how we prepare for them that matters." Elena's eyes dropped to the table. "What is this?" "A solution," Victoria said gently, though her innocent were entirely devoid of warmth. "To a mistake that has gone on far too long." Down the hall, the heavy front door of the mansion clicked shut. Nate stepped into the marble foyer, his suit slightly damp from the rain. He loosened his tie, drawing in a breath to call out for his wife, when the sharp, unfamiliar tone of his mother's voice drifted down the corridor. He paused. Something in the chilling cadence of her words made his stomach tighten. Slowly, quietly he walked toward the living room, stopping just out of sight behind the half-open door. "This is a trust fund for the child," Victoria explained, tapping a manicured fingernail against the thick documents. "It is generous enough to ensure you both live very comfortably anywhere else in the country. Beside it is a blank check for your immediate relocation." Elena did not flinch. Her hand remained protectively over her unborn child. "You want me to leave?" "I want you to be realistic," Victoria smiled, stepping closer. "You are a lovely girl, Elena, but you do not belong in the Sterling family. Nathaniel is blinded by infatuation right now, but eventually he will realize the burden of carrying a wife who cannot keep up with our world. I am simply offering you an exit with dignity before things get incredibly ugly." Nate stood paralyzed in the shadows of the hallway, the exhaustion drained from his bones, replaced by a cold, suffocating shock. The elegant, loving mother who had raised him was vanishing before his very eyes, replaced by a ruthless stranger who measured human life in dollars and reputation. "Nate is my husband," said, her voice quiet but utterly unshaken. "He is the father of this baby." Victoria's the polite facade finally slipped, revealing the razor-sharp cruelty underneath. She pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at Elena's face. "Nate is my son, and this family's legacy will not be dragged into the mud by a girl who restores old junk for a living." Through the crack in the door, Nate watched the scene unfold like a waking nightmare. There was his pregnant wife, standing resolute in her pale dress, her hand resting over their child, refusing to shrink away. And there was his mother, her arm outstretched, wielding her wealth and status like a weapon to erase the woman he loved. "Sign the divorce papers, Elena," Victoria commanded, her voice dropping the honeyed accent entirely. "Take the money. Leave Charleston tonight before the storm hits. And do not ever look back." Elena did not cry. She stood in the center of the suffocating room, her fingers brushing the brass compass resting against her chest, holding her ground against the most powerful woman in the city. Victoria slammed her palm flat against the glass table, the sharp crack echoing through the silent house. "Sign it!" In the dark hallway, Nate held his breath behind the door, his heart hammering against his ribs as he's waited to see if his quiet wife would finally crumble, or if she would fight back. The sharp crack of a palm against glass hung in the heavy air of the living room, competing only with the rising howl of the wind outside. Did not flinch. She kept her hand firmly over her stomach, feeling a tiny reassuring flutter beneath her palm. Victoria stood tall on the opposite side of the coffee table, expecting the young woman to finally crumble into tears, to beg, or to snatch the blank check in a fit of desperate survival. Instead, the room stretched into a thick, suffocating silence. Elena lowered her gaze to the documents, slowly, deliberately. Her fingertips rested against the edge of the manila folder and the crisp white envelope. With a steady motion, she slid them back across the smooth surface until they stopped just inches from her mother-in-law. "My child does not have a price," Elena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a quiet steel that seemed to anchor her to the very floorboards of the mansion. "And neither do I." In the shadowed hallway, Nate felt the breath he had been holding slowly release. He had almost stepped forward to shield her, to play the savior, but the sheer gravity of his wife's composure kept him rooted in the dark. He watched, a profound sense of awe washing over his initial shock. Elena wasn't a fragile girl out of her depth, she was an immovable force. Victoria's perfect posture stiffened. The polite honey-sweet facade she wore for Charleston society began to crack, giving way to a venomous sneer.
Hey, do not mistake your stubbornness for nobility, Elena.
Victoria stepped around the table, invading the younger woman's personal space, her voice dropping to a harsh, biting whisper. "You spend your days scraping dirt off old canvases because you have no future of your own to build. You think you are protecting your dignity? Your people never had any to begin with. You are just a stray from the coastal mud who managed to find an open door, and I am closing it." Elena's chin lifted. She refused to give the older woman the satisfaction of a screaming match, answering the brutal insults with a gaze as sharp as a knife. "You can insult me all you want, but I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly where I came from. I will not sign your papers." Furious that her money and her cruelty had failed, Victoria took another aggressive step forward, raising her hand to point directly at Elena's chest. The words died in her throat. Victoria's manicured finger hovered in the air, trembling slightly. Her gaze had dropped, snagging on the dull gleam of the old brass compass resting against Elena's collarbone. It wasn't a valuable piece of jewelry. It was weathered, scratched, and entirely out of place in a room filled with imported silk and fine art. But, as Victoria stared at the tarnished metal, the color drained entirely from her face. From the shadows, Nate narrowed his eyes. The sudden shift in the room's atmosphere was visceral. His mother wasn't looking at Elena with aristocratic disgust anymore. The anger had evaporated, instantly replaced by something Nate had never, ever seen in Victoria Sterling's eyes. Raw, unadulterated terror. Victoria's breathing turned shallow. She reached out, her hand shaking violently. Though she didn't dare touch the pendant. "Where did you get that?" The smooth, authoritative southern drawl was gone. Her voice was thin, frail, almost a gasp. Elena looked down at her compass, then back up at the trembling woman before her. She was confused by the sudden, overwhelming panic, but she held her ground. "It belonged to my grandfather. He worked the coastline." Nate stepped slightly closer to the doorframe, his mind racing. Why would a piece of old brass terrify a woman who controlled half the real estate in the city? The hostility he had witnessed wasn't just about a poor girl marrying into a wealthy family. It was something else entirely. A ghost had just walked into the Sterling mansion, wearing his wife's face. Victoria stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the Persian rug. She looked at the compass, then at Elena, her face ashen and completely stripped of its aristocratic mask. Elias, Victoria whispered, the name slipping out of her like a curse from a buried past, a name that left Nate standing in the dark, entirely stunned. Nate did not step out from behind the door. The name, his mother had just gasped, Elias, hung in the suffocating air of the hallway, paralyzing his initial instinct to intervene. Instead of confronting her, he took a slow, silent step backward. The storm outside lashed against the mansion's massive windows, the thunder masking the sound of his retreat as he turned away from the living room. The house was entirely dark now, save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the long, marble corridors. Nate bypassed the grand staircase and headed straight for the east wing. His mother's private study, which doubled as the archive for the family's oldest acquisitions, was locked behind a heavy mahogany door. But Nate was the executive vice president of the company. He knew the security codes as well as his own name. He punched in the numbers. The lock clicked and he slipped inside. He didn't dare turn on the overhead lights. Pulling a small brass flashlight from the desk drawer, he swept the narrow beam across the rows of locked filing cabinets. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow. Part of him, the privileged son raised in absolute luxury, screamed at him to walk away. Opening these drawers meant crossing a line he could never uncross. It meant potentially destroying the empire that was supposed to protect his unborn child. But then he pictured Elena, standing so fiercely in her simple dress, refusing to be bought. She had looked more regal than anyone in his bloodline. Nate walked over to the furthest cabinet, the one holding the records from the company's foundational years. He pulled the drawer open. The smell of aged paper and stale air hit him. He bypassed the recent portfolios and dug into the back, pulling out thick, heavy folders marked with the coastal development zones. He laid them out on the polished desk, pinning the flashlight between his shoulder and jaw. He began flipping through decades of correspondences, land surveys, and tax records. For several minutes, it was just standard corporate jargon. Then, the name appeared. It was on an original deed for the sprawling miles of coastline that now housed the family's most lucrative commercial properties. Nate's heart hammered against his ribs. He pulled out a stack of internal memos clipped together, recognizing the meticulous, slanted handwriting of Marcus Thorne, the family's most trusted senior attorney. The memos discussed tax loopholes, aggressive acquisition strategies, and finally, a foreclosure notice that made absolutely no logical sense. Nate pushed the memos aside and found the property transfer agreements. He laid the original land survey, signed by Elias, next to the final transfer deed that supposedly surrendered the land to the Sterlings. Nate leaned in, bringing the flashlight closer. The original signature was jagged and heavy, written by a man who clearly worked with his hands. The signature on the transfer deed, however, was smooth, calculated, and entirely different. It was a forgery, a blatant, undeniable forgery, and right beneath it was the notary stamp, authorized by Marcus Thorne, accompanied by a wire transfer receipt directed to a local county official. A wave of profound nausea washed over Nate. He gripped the edge of the heavy desk to steady himself. Everything made sickening sense now. His mother had never hated Elena for being poor. Victoria had been terrified. She had looked at Elena's antique compass and realized that the granddaughter of the man she had robbed, the man whose stolen legacy built the very walls of this mansion, was now carrying the next sterling heir. The wealth Nate had enjoyed his entire life suddenly felt like dirt on his hands. The elegant dinners, the private schools, the tailored suits, all of it was bought with the stolen dignity of his wife's family. The respect he had held for his mother shattered completely in the dark room, dissolving into a cold, sharp disgust. She wasn't a proud Southern matriarch protecting her family. She was a thief who used lawyers instead of weapons. Nate gathered the forged deeds, the bank statements, and Marcus Thorne's damning memos, slipping them carefully into a leather briefcase. The terrifying hesitation that had gripped him at the door was entirely gone. In its place was a surgical, icy resolve. He snapped the briefcase shut and turned off the flashlight, letting the darkness of the room swallow him for one last second. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen cast a pale blue glow over his hardened features. He dialed a number he knew by heart, ignoring the late hour. "It's Nathaniel," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, steady calm. "I don't care about the storm. Call the board of directors. I want an emergency meeting at the corporate office at first light." The gray, washed-out light of morning filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling corporate boardroom. The worst of the coastal storm had blown over during the but the sky remained a bleak, bruised purple. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed above the long mahogany table, casting a cold, unforgiving glare over the assembled executives. The air was suffocatingly tense. Nate stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of absolute, icy calm. He wore a dark suit, his posture rigid. Around him, the board of directors murmured in low, anxious tones, confused by the sudden summons. At the far end,
Marcus Thorne.
the family's senior attorney, nervously adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses and refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The heavy glass doors swung open, and Victoria Sterling walked in. She looked as immaculate as ever, her pearls gleaming against her silk blouse, her hair untouched by the damp morning air. But there was a sharp, irritated tightness around her eyes. She took her seat with a slow, deliberate grace, projecting the absolute authority of a woman who had ruled this empire with an iron fist for decades. "Nathaniel," Victoria said, her voice dripping with that familiar, honeyed exasperation. "Calling an emergency meeting at this hour is highly irregular. I understand you are under a great deal of personal stress. Your wife's sudden departure last night was unfortunate." She offered a sympathetic, deeply patronizing smile to the board members. "But we do not bring our domestic disputes into the boardroom. Let's conclude this nonsense so we can all get back to work." Nate didn't raise his voice. He didn't bother to defend Elena to a room full of strangers. He simply stared at the woman who had raised him, feeling a hollow ache in his chest because he still didn't know where his wife had gone in the freezing rain. But that agonizing uncertainty only crystallized his purpose. He was no longer a son seeking his mother's approval. He was a man burning down a corrupt house. "This meeting has nothing to do with my marriage, Mother," Nate said, his voice flat and lethal. It has to do with extreme liability." He reached down and unlatched his leather briefcase. The sharp click echoed like a gunshot and in the flat he pulled out a thick stack of documents and tossed them onto the center of the polished wood table. "Decades ago, the foundational tract of our coastal development was acquired through what the official records call a standard foreclosure," Nate began, his eyes locking onto Marcus, but that was a lie. Marcus shifted violently in his leather chair, a thin sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. "Nate, please, these are ancient records. There is no need to drag this out in front of the board." "I have the original land survey," Nate interrupted, his voice cutting through the lawyer's panic. He slid a copied document down the table, signed by the rightful owner, Elias. "And right next to it is the final transfer deed." He slid a second document forward. "The signature on the transfer is a complete forgery. It doesn't even remotely match the strokes of the original." Victoria's polite smile froze. The color began to drain from her face exactly as it had in the living room the evening before. "You are being hysterical, Nathaniel. You don't know what you are looking at." Nate countered, stepping forward. He pulled out the final, devastating pieces of paper. "I am looking at internal memos drafted by Marcus, discussing the payment of bribes to local county officials to push the fake deed through. I am looking at wire transfer receipts. I am looking at systemic, undeniable fraud." The murmurs around the table instantly died. The board members, wealthy men and women who valued their own legal security above all else, stared at the papers in absolute horror. "You have no right to dig through my private archives." Victoria finally snapped, her aristocratic Southern belle facade shattering completely. She stood up, her hands planted aggressively on the table. "I built this company, I expanded our legacy. Everything you have, everything you wear, is because I had the stomach to do what was necessary to protect our family when your father passed. You owe me your entire life."
You didn't protect us, Nate said, the deep disgust bleeding into his words.
"You turned us into thieves." Addressing the panicked faces of the board, The documents on this table expose this company to catastrophic legal and financial ruin if they are brought to light by an outside investigation. As Executive Vice President, I am invoking the emergency liability clause in our corporate bylaws. Marcus opened his mouth to object, to offer some twisted legal defense, but a single hard glare from Nate silenced him. The old lawyer slumped back in his chair, trembling, knowing the paper trail Nate held was utterly indefensible. I am calling for the immediate removal of Victoria Sterling from her position as CEO and chairwoman of this board. Nate stated, his words ringing out cold and final. Effective this exact second, she is to have no further access to funds, properties, or legal counsel representing this firm.
You cannot do this to me!
Victoria shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass walls, completely stripped of its usual elegance. I am your mother, and I am saving the company from its greatest threat. The sheer weight of the evidence, the undeniable proof of criminal liability, made the decision for them. In the heavy silence of the fluorescence-lit room, the empire Victoria had built on stolen ground was legally, permanently stripped from her hands. The fight drained out of Victoria all at once. Her knees buckled slightly, and she sank back into her heavy leather chair. Her immaculate posture crumbled, leaving her looking suddenly small, frail, and utterly defeated. Nate stared at her for a long moment. He felt a strange, hollow satisfaction mixed with a deep mourning ache for the family he thought he had known. He reached out, snapped his empty briefcase shut, and turned on his heel. Victoria sat paralyzed, completely stripped of her power, as she watched her only son walk out of the glass doors without giving her a single backward glance. The storm that had battered the coastline for 2 days finally broke, leaving behind a sky of brilliant fractured blue. Down on the last narrow strip of untouched shoreline, the air smelled sharply of sea salt, damp earth, and pine. Inside the weathered wooden frame of her grandfather's old art restoration studio, Elena quietly swept the floorboards. She had left the sprawling mansion the moment the heavy rains had started, taking nothing but the clothes she wore and a small canvas bag of her restoration tools. Now, surrounded by the familiar, comforting scent of linseed oil and aged wood, a profound sense of peace settled over her. The suffocating weight of the Sterling family, with its cold marble and colder hearts, was entirely gone. She placed a hand on her pregnant belly, feeling a soft, reassuring flutter. They were finally safe. The crunch of tires on wet gravel broke the morning quiet. Elena stopped sweeping and looked toward the open doorway, a plain, modest sedan parked near the edge of the tall coastal grass. The driver's door opened, and Nate stepped out. He looked entirely different from the man who had stood in the shadowed hallway just 24 hours earlier. The expensive tailored suit was gone, replaced by a faded button-down shirt and worn denim. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes heavy and dark, yet as he walked toward the wooden porch, there was a strange, undeniable lightness to his step. He stopped at the threshold, not presuming to step inside her sanctuary. It's done, Nate said, his voice rough but incredibly steady. The board voted at dawn. My mother has been permanently removed as CEO. She has no authority, no access to the corporate account, and absolutely no legal protection from the firm. Elena leaned the broom against a wooden workbench. She didn't smile, but the defensive tension in her shoulders slowly released. And you resigned? Nate answered, his gaze never leaving hers. I surrendered my shares and waived all my rights to the Sterling Trust. The lawyers are turning the forged deeds over to the state authorities to sort out the restitution. He looked around the humble sunlit studio, taking in the stacked canvases and the peeling paint on the walls. He swallowed hard, the immense guilt of the past finally giving way to the bare, honest truth of the present. I don't have a mansion to offer you anymore, Elena, he said quietly, his hands resting in his pockets. I don't have a vast fortune, and I don't have a powerful name. I just have me. I know my family caused yours an unforgivable amount of pain. I know I was blind to it for far too long. You don't owe me forgiveness, and you certainly don't owe me a place in your life. He took a slow breath, looking down at the worn wooden floorboards. But if you'll let me, I want to stay. Not to buy my way back in. Just to work, to help you fix whatever needs fixing. I want to be a father who actually stands in the light. Elena watched him in silence. She had spent months surviving in a house built on lies, learning to read the subtle threats hidden in polite, aristocratic smiles. But looking at Nate now, there were no masks. There was only a man who had willingly burned down his own empire to protect her and their child. Slowly, Elena reached up. Her fingers brushed against the old brass compass, resting at her collarbone. For so long it had felt like a heavy reminder of a stolen past, a silent weapon that had terrified a corrupt woman. But as the morning sun poured through the open doorway, the tarnished metal caught the light, gleaming warmly against her skin. It was no longer a ghost of what was lost. She looked at the damaged canvas resting on the easel, then back to her husband. "There is a lot of wood that needs sanding, on the back porch," Elena said softly, a gentle, forgiving warmth finally entering her voice. "And the roof still leaks near the corner." Nate's weary eyes widened slightly, a profound, overwhelming relief washing over his face. He didn't rush forward to embrace her or make grand, sweeping promises. He understood that healing wasn't a sudden miracle, but a quiet, daily choice. Nate simply nodded. He stepped through the doorway. Walking into the small, sun-drenched room slowly, he reached down and rolled up his sleeves, his hands ready to earn an honest life. The storm had washed the coast clean, and the brass compass on Elena's chest caught the bright, steady sunlight, finally pointing exactly where they were always meant to be: home.